I was 35, married to David. I was a pastor's wife. We had lived through a very traumatic church denominational split. David was in a new location. We had two boys, who were 5 and 6, and an 18-month-old daughter, and I was expecting my fourth child. I had begun home educating. I was working part-time as a family practitioner. I was very active in our local church and motivated primarily by the desire to serve God to the fullest in every area of life. That meant I was quite perfectionist in my outlook. I wanted to do the best and be the best. But around 10 weeks of that pregnancy, I began to feel somewhat detached from the world around me. I became very emotional, very sad, obsessional about things that ordinarily would not have bothered me whatsoever. As time went on, I became very focused on what I felt was adrift in my spiritual life. My devotions were all the same, but I couldn't concentrate anymore, and I felt God was drifting away from me until I reached a point where I felt abandoned by God. I wasn't, but I felt that way. I began to read more of the Bible, read more Christian books, expend more effort in trying to recapture that sense of God's presence. I would ignore all the fear and the emotional upset, and I would work harder. But increasingly, I was experiencing anxiety symptoms. And one day in particular, I was sitting still trying to unwind when I felt an overwhelming sense of terror and fear, which came from nowhere. My heart was pounding. I knew it wasn't a physical thing, that there was something going on emotionally and psychologically that I could not understand. At that point, I told David what I was experiencing, and neither of us really understood it. And the sense of terror became constant, so much so that at night I was afraid going to sleep. I was afraid in my sleep. I was experiencing nightmares. And then I began to wake like a startled bird around 5 o'clock in the morning, unable to get back to sleep, and getting up, going out of the house just to get away from this fear. One particular night, as I again was reading my Bible, trying to find some help, I began to pray. I felt I'd lost all connection with God. I felt like literally felt as if I was emotionally dropped off a cliff and I could not climb up. I felt like I was falling, and there was no bottom. And there was certainly no way to ever get back out of that. I realized objectively that I must be suffering from a depression. Presented with this in a consultation room, I would have immediately seen that. But when it's yourself and there's so much subjective involved, I felt this is major depression, but it's caused by a spiritual problem, and I can't find this problem. What is it that's caused this? I saw a colleague who put me on an antidepressant, and I then began to, with David's help, try to scrabble around for other solutions in addition to that, especially spiritual. We enlisted the help of my dad, who had been a pastor for 50 years. And with his help, we came to see that this was not just a spiritual problem. And in actual fact, the spiritual symptoms, if you like, were on the back of an emotional, physical breakdown. He, knowing me well, and we lived not that far from my parents, I saw a lot of them. He and my mother had seen this coming. They'd seen that I was stretched to my limit. I worked morning, noon and night. I never stopped for breaks, never took days off to replenish myself. And here I was in this pit and struggling. I felt like a bobbing cork in the ocean, with the storm raging and just out of control, utterly helpless. By God's grace, with various approaches, as well as focusing on spiritual, yes, but taking a lot of rest, talking to David, talking to others close to me, and also the help of a Christian psychiatrist or psychologist, you would probably call them in this country, I came to realize that my thought processes and my perfectionist tendencies had to a large extent led up to this. And I began to read and understand that you have to also correct how you think about certain things. Things like negativity, misinterpreting a situation or misinterpreting my own reaction to things. If I fell short of my own standards, then what I've done is hopeless. But in God's eyes, it's not like that. As I began to mentally recover through exercise as well and diet and just much more holistic approach, I came to see that this indeed was a depression primarily that had resulted in a spiritual breakdown. The spiritual began to improve, and over time I began to sense God's love again and began to see God's grace in my life, and have grown in that over the years to understand that I am a fallen creature, and therefore I live in a fallen world. I can never achieve perfection. There is no limit to the demands of this world in our lives. As a conscientious Christian woman who are conscientious will suffer most likely the same problem unless we understand our limitations.
Here's me, a pastor of 5, 6, 7 years, watching this and really didn't have a clue how to fix it. I'm a fix-it guy. Well, most guys are. I knew it wasn't spiritual in terms of cause because I knew Shona so well. She was a godly woman and I knew her life inside out, and yet I'd been taught depression, there must be a sin. And over a long period of time, came to realize, no, the spiritual symptoms were the result of other causes. And once Shona started addressing the physical, the mental, the emotional, the social, the spiritual came back again. So it was a great learning experience for us, because here's Shona, she's a doctor, a medical doctor, she's helped people with depression in her practice, and yet didn't really recognize it in herself. And here's me, a pastor, supposed to be able to help people, and felt helpless and hopeless. And so it was a wonderful learning experience throughout it all.
Although not so wonderful.
Not wonderful at the time. No, it was very dark. And yet, here we are, 15 years later, and much good has come out of it. Not least your book, which we hope will help a lot of women avoid this and also get out of it. And of course, I watched Shona go through this, and we learned a lot, and we're careful, but I was indestructible, personally. That was never going to happen to me. And yet it did. And in my case, the stress, the overload, the burnout was not manifest so much in the emotional as it was in Shona. It was more in the physical. I love my work, and I like to work hard, and I did so for many years, but I did too much for too long, at too high a pace, thinking I was not affected by the limitations of being human. And then God stopped me. One night I was sitting in my chair and felt this pain go straight across my chest. This was 3-4 years ago. And I really thought, I'm done. This is a heart attack or something. But although it was sore and uncomfortable, it passed. I called Shona, and then I started the man thing. It's nothing, and she's going, you've got to go to ER, and I'm sort of saying, what do you think, you are, a doctor? But she persuaded me. I said, well, I'll do it, but only for you. Really nice guy here. And so we went to ER, cut a long story short. All the EKGs were fine. And then I mentioned to the doctor, I've had a pain in my calf my calf muscle, leg muscle for the last few days. I travelled to Canada in a rush, so much of a rush I didn't stop, 6-hour journey in the car without a stop. And I got out with a bit of a pain in my leg. I just thought, well, it's a muscle strain from Taekwondo or something like that. Didn't get better. Did the same thing on the way back, 6 hours, no stop. It was really bad by the time I got home to Grand Rapids. And again, I thought, well, just push through. And then, of course, a night later, I'm sitting in the chair, and that's when this happens. And unknown to me, I'd formed this blood clot in my leg, which had broken off and gone into my lungs. Pulmonary embolism. And when the doctor heard me say I'd had this pain, he started running these tests. And he came back a few years later and said, you've got multiple blood clots in both lungs. Now, a lot of people die immediately. And I'd heard this kind of thing from Shona as a doctor before. And I'd heard of people dying, and I realised, wow, this is serious. And I got up to go to the bathroom or something, and the doctor said, do not move. You've got a life-threatening illness. And again, it just really hit me. And over the next few days, a time of tremendous self-examination. What's God saying to me in this? And I felt, I'd heard whispers for months, as it were, from God. You're going too fast. You're not resting. But this was God through my blood saying, stop. And yeah, I believe it was overload, it was burnout, manifested in my body eventually saying, enough, no more. And so kind of learned many of the same lessons that Shona learned, the need for rest, the need for limitations, need for exercise, need for friendships, need to trust the Lord more, try not to be sovereign myself, let Him actually be sovereign, and put a lot of good things in place, but defaulting back eventually to my old self, and ended back in hospital again with blood clots a few years later. And that was like the end. Okay, I'll really listen this time. And that was really, I started writing about it, my experience of burnout and all that I'd learned. And that's when men started contacting me. Can you help me? I feel I'm in the same position. I'm there, or I'm going there. Can you? And all these stories and all these counselling opportunities, and pastors, a lot of pastors. And so kind of just over time, God was preparing the way for, with my own painful story, other men's, learning the lessons from them, from myself, from the Lord. And then Justin Taylor approached me to ask me to write this book, and it just all seemed to come together in God's providence. Although these were painful, worrying, terrible times, again, God is sovereign and brings good out of them. And if we can help people out of these situations or not get into them, then we'll be really thankful to God.